Welcome to day two, round two. I was going to call it day two, a little less antagonistic maybe, of Beat Internationalism. Remember, there is a day three. That's kind of my own personal interest because I will be presenting as well tomorrow. So, I'd like to see all of you for day three as well. Just a quick overview. I mean, you all kind of know what's going on. I mean, I guess the two questions that are really kind of floating around are, what is, this is from the synopsis. What does beat mean for contemporary audiences? And, how does beat radicalism manifest internationally? That seems to be two, not the only points, but certainly two of the driving concerns. So hopefully, that we can think about that today and as well as more. So if we can hold questions to the end, that'd be great. You can unmute. I mean, it's probably best to unmute. You don't have to, but certainly, obviously, give the speakers, full reign when they're talking. And then if you can just kind of wait till the end, and we can have a Q&A. So let's start with Judy. Let me quickly toggle back and read a short bio, and we can get started. So, all right, so Judy graduated in 2019 from National Chung Cheng University in Taiwan with the first class honors degree in psychology and philosophy. She has an ongoing interest in visual art, literature, and translation, having translated letters of Taiwanese modernist novelists. I'm going to mispronounce this, but Qi Deng Sheng.
Qi Deng Sheng. It's all right.
Sheng, and Professor, I can do this one, A. Robert Lee's poetry. AKA Bob, right, for a lot of us. She plans to study for a master's degree in comparative literature in the UK and continue her research on Yuan-chia and Hong Kong writer Eileen Chung. So welcome to the panel, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, so may I share my screen now?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, can everyone see this? Okay, so hello everyone, my name is Hsia Yu, or you can call me Judy. And first of all, I want to thank Ben and Eric for holding this beautiful event. And this is my first paper, so I've been quite nervous, but I will try my best. So here I go. So today, my topic is about Yuan-chia's art and transnationalism, a connection with the Beat generation. I arrived on this beautiful earth, a quote from Yuan-chia. Yuan-chia, a painter, photographer, curator, sculptor, poet, calligrapher, laborer, and one of the pioneers of Chinese modernist art, praised as the earliest Chinese conceptual artist and the most original and radical post-war artist. Like a lot of beat writers and artists, Yuan-chia is open to multiple material creation and experimental art. Throughout his life, he has been staying in different countries. Born in China, later moved to Taiwan, then Italy, and finally settled in the UK. Yuan-chia's art has a strong personal style, and he combines the simplicity and minimalism of East Asian visual art with Western avant-garde styles, such as abstract expressionism. He often paints with calligraphic symbols with ink backgrounds and abstract blocks of colors. It is plausible that it is his transnational travel experience that made an influence on his art. However, Lee developed his art from his Taoism center and created the concept of cosmic point, and later in his life, Toei art. Born in 1929, Lee was in the historical context of World War II, which overlaps the time the Beat generation started. In Lee's art and throughout his life, I found it interesting that a lot of key spirits of Lee resemble that of Beats, such as radicalness, avant-garde, spiritual pursuit, transnationalism, and Taoism. After the atom bomb fell in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world has so changed. As lives can be destroyed in a blink of an eye, the meaning and purpose of the existence of human beings are constantly checked and constantly questioned. A lot of new thinking and transformation took place at the time. No matter the form of art, processing from outer realistic description into a more interior, spiritual, and abstract portrait. or the new wave of philosophy, for instance, the emerge of existentialism, or the social and political movements such as communism or pro-democracy or anti-war movements. Born in Guangxi, in the south of China, Li was brought up in idyllic and rustic countryside. In 1948, Li entered a special school for the children of Chiang Kai-shek officers, and in the next year, after KMT was defeated by communists, Li arrived in Taiwan with other students from special school. He later entered art education department of Taipei Normal College for teacher training and met Xiao Qing and Huo Gang, who were also refugees from China. Dissatisfied by the traditional aesthetic and academic training in the college, Li then studied with Li Zhongshen, who had studied art in Japan, mastering European and traditional Chinese art, bringing in the concept of surrealism and modernism into his art class. He emphasizes the importance of developing a coordination between hand, eye, and mind through drawing. And according to Xiao Qing, as I quote, encourage each of us to fully exploit our own characteristics and personalities, end quote. Under Li's instruction, his students are developed into different and unique styles, and the first generation of Li's disciples founded the East Painting Association, Dongfang Huahui, in 1956, and staged their first joint exhibition at the Taipei News Building in November 1957, which not only caused a sensation in Taiwan's conservative environment of art then, but also earned them the appellation of Eight Great Outlaw, or Eight Wild Horses, which implies that these artists were very daring and extraordinary at the time. I think this art group was significant as I try to compare Li to the Beat generation. Dongfang Huahui stands as a cluster of young and radical avant-garde artists that were not afraid to express themselves, just like Beat generation. However, in 1950s, the political atmosphere in Taiwan was still full of tension. After World War II, in order to suppress political dissidents, KMT had implemented martial law, which lasted from 1947 to 1987, and the period is known as White Terror in Taiwan history. During that period, people were labeled as bandit spies if they did anything that seems against KMT or pro-communist. Therefore, a lot of intellectuals and social elites were imprisoned or executed, and a lot of them were wrongly accused. So as you can imagine, at that paranoid age, art might lead you to death, as Diana Yale illustrated in her Utopia Beyond Cosmopolitanism, a translocal view of Yuan-chia, that the experience of enforced separation from their homes and families led Li and the other Dongfang members to art as a form of spiritual salvation. Yet, in 1950s Taiwan, cultural activity was either repressed or used to bolster political and militarization efforts. End of quote. This historical context was rather similar to the anti-communist political repression in the US, McCarthyism, which lasted from the late 1940s through the 1950s, and is known as the Second Red Scare. It is during the period of this political suppression that Beat generation movement started and created a different voice, a voice that searches for peace and freedom. So at that time in Taiwan, a lot of members in Dongfang Huahui went abroad under the political force, included Huo Gang and Xiao Qing. I mentioned them earlier. In 1962, with the help and invitation from Xiao Qing, Li left for Italy and joined Il Panto, which means the Point Group, established by Xiao Qing and other artists. In fact, before Il Panto, Li was already focusing on the concept of point. He claimed, in 1959, my first painting was a tiny black dot on a white square of canvas. Nothing could be simpler than that. End of quote. As a form of abstract expressionism, Ilapanto wanted to put a stop or put a point to this instinctive way of working and sold a more spiritual approach to art. And this involved engaging with the ancient philosophies of China, India, Tibet, and Japan. From these painting on papers, folded book, or scrolls, we can see how dots are presented on the paper in space, which shows Taoism and forms a crucial element of Li's cosmic point concept, according to Li. In these drawings, I was influenced by the basic idea of the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu and by Chinese calligraphy. In the colors, I tried to recapture the spiritual quality of Chinese porcelain and ancient cave paintings. In what he said, Lao Tzu has made an influence on him and his art. Lao Tzu, the esteemed author of Tao Te Ching and the founder of Taoism, he emphasizes the importance of wu wei, which literally means to do nothing, or you might interpret it as to go with the flow or go with the Tao. And he also encourages people to live in harmony with the nature, as he believes nature has its own order and rules. Therefore, people should follow it instead of trying to dominate or resist it, which leads to his political position of anti-authoritarianism. So the philosophy of Taoism is certainly embedded in Li Yuanjia's work, as you can see here. Through his calligraphic abstract painting, you can see the way the brushes go, which seems he paints randomly, yet it is full of power and rhythm. And the composition is in fact very balanced, which echoes to what Lao Tzu says about nature and order. As under the surface of chaos, there is balance and orders underneath. Furthermore, one of the features of Li's works is that he allows the space to grow. He pursues the simplicity, space, and freedom, as he wrote. And I quote here. I always wish my works of art to be me. I always want space and freedom. End of quote. It is the concept of his art that allows audience to contemplate and to go with the flow that he creates, and then reflect on the good side of nature, simplicity, and freedom. Politically, I think Taoism is of crucial importance in the context of World War II, which influenced not only Li Yuanjia, but also Beat generation, as its anti-authoritarian perspective and highlighting in the individual's inner peace. It offers people a guidance of how to embrace the circumstances during the crisis and teaches people to find a way to seek inner peace and accept there is no absolute substances and form underneath things, only nothingness. Beat generation has a connection to Taoism and Buddhism as well, or maybe we can say Oriental culture. The spirit has made an influence on their works as well. For instance, Jack Kerouac constantly searches for spiritual enlightenment, his spontaneous writing, and his love for jazz. In his Essential of Spontaneous Prose, 1959, about procedure, as I quote, procedure, time being of the essence in the purity of speech. Sketching language is undisturbed flow from the mind of personal secret idea words, blowing as per jazz musician on subject of image. End of quote. In other words, it is important for him to go with the flow and to follow his instinct, which are essential for his creation. In his Desolation Angels, he also writes about Taoism. As I quote here, in the old Tao Chinese sense of do nothing, wu wei, which is a way of life in itself more beautiful than any, a kind of cloistral fervor in the midst of mad ranting action seekers of this or any other modern world. End of quote. This shows Kerouac's interest and pursuit of Taoism and inner peace. Other Beat writers also associated with Buddhism and Taoism, including Allen Ginsberg, Joanna Kiger, Gary Snyder, Anna Waldman, Lo Welch, and Philip Whalen. Other abstract expressionist Beat artists, such as Brian Gysin, J. Defoe, and Bernie Spin, also did calligraphic painting and had a connection with Buddhism or Asian culture. Here I would like to show some pictures to compare. So here are Li's work, as we saw earlier. And here is Geison's work. Brian Geison, an artist, a writer, a sound poet, best known for his use of the cut-top technique alongside William Burroughs. Like Lee, Geison moved to different countries in his lifetime. Born in the UK, then moved to the US, Morocco, and France. His well-known and representative artwork, écriture, which means writing paintings, creates a unique visual effect. As John Geiger wrote, as I quote here, "These calligraphic abstract compositions were based on the layering of Japanese script read vertically and Arabic script read horizontally, forming a grid with the magical appearance of language," end of quote. He uses painting to eliminate the boundary between language and image, thus creating a space for viewer to contemplate. As Geison wrote for an exhibition, as I quote, "The retina of human eye can register a new image every tenth of a second. Therefore, it could be said, a canvas by Geison provides enough visual image for the lifetime," end of quote. I think by using calligraphy as a means to accomplishing abstract expressionism gives out an enlightenment or a clue to the audiences that the artists have something to say, which might be ineffable or even incomprehensible, yet the viewer can get closer to the artist's mind with their attempt to interpret. So here we see Geison's work. I think it's very similar to Lee's work and also the colors and the use of ink. And here I want to talk about Bernice Bing. Bernice Bing's work is on the left side. Bernice Bing, a Chinese-American lesbian artist, one of the few recognized female beat artists. She was involved in San Francisco Bay Area art scene in the 1960s and was interested in the beat, Zen Buddhism, and Taoism. Instructed by her Japanese abstract art teacher, she started to create with her focus on her identity as an Asian woman. Therefore, calligraphic painting can also be regarded as a Chinese cultural identity, as it is one of the oldest forms of Chinese art. In addition to calligraphic writing, it also has a root of ink wash painting, which emphasizes a poetic, spiritual capture of the subject, no matter still life, landscape, or portrait. And on the right side is another artist named Jay Defoe. She is Bernice Bing's close friend and also is close to Beat Generation. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to Lee's life. When Lee was in Italy, he produced a series of folding painted books like this and developed his own color symbolic system. As the artist David Mandela, who later exhibited Lee's work in London, emphasized that his abstraction was not really based on Western concepts. It was based on Chinese symbolisms. As Diana Ye pointed out that, as I quote, "It also had highly personal meaning and a wider human significance. His four colors symbolized origin and end: black, blood and life, red, nobility, gold, and purity, white. And his abstraction involved meditation of human existence in the vast chaos, as well as his own journey through it. Lee's use of this ancient art form that slowly unfolds as if taking the viewer on a long journey seems opposite to his lifelong meditation on space, life, time," end of quote. I found it really interesting comparing Lee's work to Geison's. Here you can see Geison's work. This is Geison's a trip from here to there. They are spookily similar. Both used ink image on a long scroll paper to illustrate time and space. Lee's journey moves on. In 1965, Lee was invited to present his works at Signals Gallery in London. And in the next year, he decided to move to London, where Lee started to study photography and became interested in poetry, especially the concrete poems. This is Lee's concrete poems, which he might be inspired by his friends that he made when he was in London, such as Brazilian artist Mira Chandel and the poet Dom Sylvester Huddart. So here are Lee's work more. I use poem and alongside with his images. Interestingly, Dom Sylvester Huddart, a pioneer in British avant-garde art and poetry, is a great admirer of the beat and has a direct contact with the beat writers. He is friend with Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William Burroughs. So maybe we can say that Lee is indirectly connected with the beat, and through their friendship with Dom Sylvester Huddart, art and style and technique were making an interactive influence among them and maybe even became a trend. So here are some of Dom Sylvester Huddart's work, and I really love it. So you can see his collage art, also his amazing concrete poetry. He used typewriter to create, and named them as typstract. And here, his work, Sand Rock Tide, is actually published with William Burroughs on Lines Press. So I think this connection is very important. So that reminds me also of Guyon's permutation poems. Here's Guyon's permutation poem, and I am that I am. However, compare Guyon's poetry to Lee's. I think Guyon tried to use repetition to break down the language and meaning and create consciousness of the word itself, while Lee's poem is more like an interactive conversation with the readers. Okay, so in 1968, Lee moved to north of England and developed his toy art that invites viewers to play and be involved. He built his own museum. He built his own museum, like brick by brick, in 1972, which name is LYC Museum and Art Gallery at Banks. He hoped it can function as both an art museum and the center of everyday life, and therefore blended avant-garde art, local craft work, and Roman remains in a leisurely atmosphere that invites visitors to approach the works on display. As you can see, his art became interactive, that people can move them around and recreate. His cosmic magnetic point symbolizes the moment of existence of human beings in the huge universe, which I think also has collage element in it, which is again very similar to Guyon and Burroughs' work. And you can see that Lee put his everyday life images into his movable woodcraft and create a collage of space, time, and life. Okay, so to conclude, I would like to argue that although Li Yuan-chia did not have direct connection with the Beat generation, but he had a Beat sensibility as they lived under the same historical background and used similar concepts or methods to create art. His transnational experiences and as an abstract expressionist artist, I think abstract expressionist art offers them a way to combine Eastern and Western art, like a cultural intersection, to bridge, to understand different countries, especially when wars were taking place between many countries. And abstract expressionist art allows them to create art that could be closer to their spiritual mind and give not only them, but also viewers space and freedom to express and contemplate, which I think is of crucial importance in a historical context of post-World War II. So thank you for your listening. Here's my paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was fascinating, very interesting work, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions on that. So just moving quickly along so we can get everybody in. The next speaker is Benjamin Heel. I don't know if you need an introduction, but I'll give you a quick one anyway. Let's see here. Ben is an assistant professor at the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature at National Chung Cheng University, Taiwan. He's currently working on his monograph, Transatlantic Cross Currents, which explores the European connections in the work of Paul Bowles and William S. Burroughs. He's a board member of the European Beat Studies Network. Thank you for all your work over the years there, and manages the website and membership. He has published several articles on the beat and his wider research interests that include Chinese literature and translation and the works of James Leo Herlili and say again, sorry.
Perlahi.
Perlahi, and Mohammed Mrabet.
You've had all the difficult pronunciations on this one, haven't you, Erik?
Well, it's, the funny thing is I actually I Googled how to pronounce Peggy's university. So, but I should have Googled all of these because I'm messing up on the other ones too. So yeah, but I'll take it away. I'll let you take it from there.
Thanks so much, Erik. Thank you so much. And thank you, Judy. That was really, really fascinating. And lots of kind of interconnections with what we're doing. I mean, of course, because we're both doing Taiwanese sort of writers, artists as well. So yeah, I'm going to go straight in. Can everyone hear me and see my PPT and everything? Is everything okay? Yeah. Okay.
I don't see it yet.
Oh, okay. Hang on a second. Wait a second. Oh yeah, it might help if I actually shared my screen.
Yeah, you gotta share with us first.
Yeah, got it. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go straight in. And I'm looking at a more recent sort of exponent of Taiwanese poetry. So Taiwanese poet Hsia Yu, which means to rain. It's not her real name. She's forged a path over the last 30 years using an array of different techniques that restore, I feel, Taiwan's almost forgotten transnational avant-garde literary traditions, which I think, again, Judy's paper touches upon, and pushes the limits of material experimentation in book publication. So this paper will offer a brief overview of how her works present a challenging poetics that engage with the evolving function of books, text, words, and language, while also demonstrating an important affinity with 1960s beat cut-up experimentation. So do her works, again, in keeping with the theme of the conference panel, do her works count as beat internationalism in the context of what A. Robert Lee terms kinship with beat or beat-like dissent in the handbook of the Routledge handbook there. With a focus on Hsia Yu's transnational focus and genealogy, this paper aims to consider this question while demonstrating her relevance in the context of contemporary transnational and translingual poetic practice. Okay, so given that Hsia Yu lives her life between, and again, I'm thinking of this word inter again, lives between France and Taiwan, the French sensibilities are there, including things like the experiments of Rimbaud and Apollinaire. We've already referred to those as being beat influences, are important to Hsia Yu's work, as is incorporating a radical visual and material aesthetic. This is best demonstrated, I feel, by Pink Noise. There's the first slide here. I've got a copy of it here. I don't know if you can see my screen and see a copy of it. So she published this by herself in 2007, and it's actually printed on clear acetate, and you have to actually put a piece of paper like behind the page to actually be able to read it. So it's very much a kind of art object of itself. So this came out in 2007, and then there was a limited reissue as well. It cost her a lot of money to publish it herself. And as I said, its transnational inflection is in part because it is composed from cut-up texts selected at random by the poet from various internet sources, including like email spam links that she clicked on at random. And they're presented in English and French, printed in black on the right-hand pages, and then the auto-translated Chinese is in pink on the right. So she actually composed them technically composed them in English and French first. So not in her first language. So it's something of the same dissonant effect as maybe the Hands Up, Tristan Tzara multilingual performance poets, when the two poets performed different languages simultaneously. Pink Noise utilizes the semantic problems of translation by employing this early American auto-translate software that was on the Mac called Sherlock.
and so auto-translated the English and French into Chinese. Now, this allows a breakdown of meaning that results from that over-literal translation, and allows that to become part of the poetry, a bit like a kind of, when you're texting somebody and it automatically chooses the word, capturing the random machine qualities inherent in collage art and its origins in modernist multilingualism. So the beat kinship here is with the cut-up literary technique already mentioned of Brian Gysin and William Burroughs. So while the notion of cut-up poetry stems from Tristan Tzara's 1918 Dada Manifesto, where he advocates spontaneous poetry from cut newspapers, the technique was rediscovered in 1959 and expanded by Gysin and Burroughs in Paris in 1960, with Gysin proposing, and I quote, to apply the painter's techniques to writing, things as simple and immediate as collage and montage. So the use of a computer to produce poetry was also heralded by Gysin's Permutation Poems, already mentioned in Judy's paper, whereby a simple computer program, this was Ian Somerville, I think, composed this program to produce every word permutation of a one-line poem. So now pink noise demonstrates a beat sensibility of spontaneity augmented by automatism, with a Burroughsian sense of linguistic paranoia and virality. Burroughs was fascinated by the differences between reading pictographic and alphabetic languages, and in pink noise, one can see how the pictographic, ideogrammatic nature of Chinese emphasizes collage-like glitches and juxtapositions. The poetics of pink noise are described by J.B. Rollins as translingual transculturalism. Texts written in more than one language or in a language other than the author's primary one, which engage in the limits of national culture. One can argue that with auto-translate, those limits are threatened. And when one starts to trace globalized links and resonances between literatures, such as beat, such as we're dealing with here, that are firmly associated with a national culture, similar fissures can be seen to appear. Now, to trace the origins of Taiwanese experimental poetry reveals that Taiwan is itself an important site for Chinese cultural modernity. Having experienced the turbulent post-colonial and post-colonial era status, it was colonized by the Japanese in 1895, who attempted cultural assimilation before becoming the post-World War II stronghold of Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalism. Now, each of these periods had this profound impact on Taiwanese language use and cultural production, though this was not entirely a negative process. Now, in this context, one can begin to see Hsia Yu's work as a natural expression of Taiwan's expansive cosmopolitan identity, which is increasing now as English has sort of become endorsed as an official language. Now, multilingual poetry, as Leonard Forster states, highlights the political importance of the matrix of language and nation in cultural contexts. Hsia Yu's multilingualism should therefore be seen in the context of Western modernist works such as The Wasteland and others. So the translingual and transcultural nature of such texts, as Forster notes, constructs, and I quote, an immensely flexible web of interwoven multiple associations, in which the very imprecision of words becomes an advantage, end quote. A statement I feel that aptly describes Hsia Yu's work. Further genealogies can be seen in the multimedia approach of the Dadaists, such as Hans Earp, the bilingual painter, sculptor, collage artist, and poet who regarded language as simply another material for art. Similarly, pink noise treats words as materials and carefully demonstrates the materiality of the work itself, a material aesthetic that draws attention to the book status as physical object and piece of creative art. And of course, it connects with that history of concrete poetry too. Hsia Yu's work should therefore also be seen in the context of the 1930s influx of Dada and Surrealism into Taiwan via the Les Moulins Poetry Society, which was founded in 1933 by Yang Chi-chung. This was an influential group of artists and poets who adapted those Western movements into new forms they found appropriate for contemporaneous Taiwan. sort of issuing realism for what they saw as the form of resistance in surrealism. Members of the group and other artists were imprisoned under Chiang Kai-shek when the KMT arrived during the White Terror, and their work was suppressed for decades. And of course, the decades after that, there was not only formal censorship, but artists, poets had to self-censor themselves to some extent because of the sort of fear of this during this period. So while beat affinities with dissent and nonconformity persist, and of course we can see parallels Judy mentioned with McCarthyism and that period, I think the situation is perhaps more serious in Taiwan. Hsia Yu's work and experimentation is deeply rooted in Dadaism. Now this experimentation takes her work beyond the multilingualism of modernist collage poems towards something more contemporary, through what Rollins describes as, and I quote, forms of language poetry in which Chinese demonstrates linguistic elements never before exhibited, end quote. He points to Hsia Yu's surprising exclusion from transcultural perspectives as noted by Fred McMarco, and I quote, hers is a rich, sensual, and absolutely international sensibility that is as much at home writing about salsa and Che Guevara as it is writing about the Qing dynasty or old Cathay, end quote. Yet it is the way her work engages with collage and cut-up techniques, both materially and with language, that remains compelling, particularly in the context of beat, nation, and the operation of power. Now, her second poetry collection, Ventriloquy, came out in 1991, has links with Apollinaires calligrams in its layering of text and image that highlights ideogrammatic Chinese. You can see this in the slide through the in the poem, The Missing Elephant, which is on the slide there, which plays on the fact that the Chinese character Xiang means both elephant and image. The text of the poem is drawn directly from a section of the Taoist text I Ching, rewritten by substituting the recurring character for image with glyphs of animals, plants, and objects. This exposes the subjectivity involved in interpreting image and how written languages have evolved from representational art, and how collage is about juxtaposition and contrast, in the sense that it exposes the workings behind a work and the systems and conventions we rely on for representation. Now, this is especially apt with regards to a 1995 collection, Rub Ineffable, which rearranges text that was cut itself from the previous published work, Ventriloquy. Hsia Yu describes her technique in Pink Noise as a variation of the one she uses in Rub Ineffable, much like the distinction Burroughs makes between the cut-up and fold-in methods. And I quote, I use the cut and paste technique, just like with my third volume, Rub Ineffable. But instead of the scissors and paper and an occasional contribution from the wind, I did everything with the computer. I wonder if the reference to the wind is a reference to Le Moulin here. So in slide 7 here, 1999 Salsa continued to focus on the materiality of the text by forcing readers to cut the book's decal edges before they could read it, and to physically cut through it. So such a foregrounding of materiality, I feel, recalls Said's notion of the worldliness of the text, its status as both a cultural object, but also as a political act in itself, like in the world. So Burroughs experimented across media with tape and sound experiments and a series of films which juxtaposed language, image, and sound. And such cross-media juxtapositions and contrasts are themselves all features of Hsia Yu's work. The dissonance that noise creates, referenced by the title Pink Noise, points to a range of dichotomies that the work seeks to reconcile: author-reader, giver and receiver of love, transmitter and receiver of sound, untranslated and translated text, opaque and transparent. I'm also thinking of Said's notion of the will to power of the text, how it has a kind of direct power over and is non-democratic in that the text sort of travels in one direction. And also I think Pink Noise is itself, some offices Businesses will use pink noise as a background to sort of boost productivity as well. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so the exposure of these dichotomies through democratized openness was central to the original Dada project. You have Maldoror exhorting that poetry should be made by all, and core to Burroughs' conception of the cut-ups, where cut-ups are for everyone. This is also central to Hsia Yu's poetics through self-published works that engage the reader directly in material practices. Perhaps most notably, in the context of Hsia Yu's connection with cut-up aesthetics, is the unpublished version of the Geiss-Burroughs collaboration, The Third Mind. I'm wondering if this is going to be coming out soon. I know David Schneiderman is working, I think, on getting this published. So this was an art book collection of photo montages, calligraphics, collages, and cut-up texts. Now, Hsia Yu's 2014 collection, First Person, in the title itself, Third Mind, First Person, I feel responds intelligently to this by presenting 400 random photographs of Paris, given poetic subtitles in both French and English. It's itself a juxtaposition of language and image. I've got a copy of it here. I don't know if you can see some of these kind of images and words here, and I'll show you closer up on the slide as well. So it's like crazy self-published piece of art here. Yeah, so it's given these poetic subtitles in both French and English, which is this juxtaposition of language and image, and the effect, I feel, is very similar to those newspaper and photo collages you see here in The Third Mind. You can see here it's a closer up slide, and that's a close-up of the image there. Okay, so moving on, Hsia Yu's 2011 twin texts, This Zebra and That Zebra, you can see on the right hand of the slide here, collect the lyrics she wrote for several successful Taiwanese recording artists under her pen name, Katie Lee. So again, this doubling of names using a pen name here. So by representing the lyrics as poetry, the poet and lyricist Hsia Yu, Katie Lee, and the twin books highlight the bifurcation of poetry into lyrics and their respective differences in published media. I think we touched on this yesterday, and I think Sonya's paper talked about the origins of poetry and lyricism here. So this zebra, you can see, is monochromatic with texts that actually flow right across both pages, while that zebra is vibrantly colorful and is actually cut in half horizontally. I think I've got you can see it better in that slide, right? So it's sort of, the whole text is cut in half. So there are more than 20,000 possible rearranged texts that you can create from that book. There's archival evidence too of Burroughs' experimentation with color himself, particularly in his cut-up practice, along with his attempt to connect Rimbaud's conception that the color vowels by dividing that first edition of Soft Machine into color-coded sections. And like Burroughs, Hsia Yu also released an album of readings with a musical backing. So we have this sort of transmedial stuff going on, which we touched upon yesterday too. So Hsia Yu's texts are more than simple cybertexts, rooted as they are in transnational avant-gardism and Taiwanese literature, language, and culture. Hsia Yu's texts are intended as collage, to be considered for their visual aesthetic as much as for the meaning of the words. Indeed, that title, Rub Ineffable, points to the inadequacy of language as a means of expression, and also possibly referencing Burroughs' stated aim of cut-ups as rub out the word. I think that's also Geissen as well. So Hsia Yu's work is collage in the sense that Foucault attributed to Paul Reverberated art, composed of the energy generated by the breakdown of representation. Her poetics focus on the book as object in the world and beyond the ideological power of language. Now, the power of the ink in Pink Noise is contrasted strongly with the transparency of the pages themselves. And this transparency makes the text unreadable as the words merge in that visual noise. Even like her latest work that came out just last year, Axis of Spine, it even kind of issues ink There's no ink in the text at all. It just employs this barely readable Braille-like embossing. It's just so kind of beautiful, and you can't even see the words there. It's just sort of eventually going to kind of disappear. So it's this sense that pulls Hsia Yu's work out of the realm of, or into the realms of politics, through techniques that draw attention to the inner and outer workings of poetry itself as material practice, giving words a physicality that resonate with the sense that language has a dangerous physical and political presence. So I hope this paper has been able to demonstrate some of the value of using beat as a lens to view global literatures, which is not as American-centric as it might first appear. With her clear beat affinity, Hsia Yu's work is a radical departure from the largely formalist tradition in Sinophone and Taiwanese literatures. She exists on the boundaries of specificity by embracing a translingualism and experimentation that can be traced to earlier transnational connections. Looking forward, it may be appropriate to consider Hsia Yu and other international beats in the context of an inter- or post-national collage aesthetic, as a form of what translator and poet Pierre Joris terms nomad poetics, seen in terms of multiples crossing languages as a material flux of language matter. Indeed, with Axes of Spine, the content inside documents the poet burning all her possessions and wandering around France. Now, it doesn't get more nomadic and beat than that. Thanks for listening.
Well, that's another great paper, and I'm interested to hear what people have to say. I'm interested to put that into dialogue with Judy's work as well. It's a lot. I have 100 questions, but let's move on just to kind of keep things flowing. Our final speaker today is Peggy Piccini. Briefly read her bio here, and we'll get started. So Peggy Piccini is associate professor at C.Y. Sevgi Paris University, where she teaches translation and American literature. Her interests in scholarship include beat studies, cultural production, and communal identity, public reading, and performance. I thought this was a bit modest, so I want to supplement that really quickly. I think, she's also, head of the Applied Foreign Languages Department. And
I'm no longer.
You're no longer, okay.
No,
so
I'm no longer. So
the former head of Applied Foreign Language Department, and translated Allen Ginsberg's letters, and also her publications include City Lights and the Emergence of Beat Poetry, Contemporary French Beat Writing, which sounds interesting, and Tangier and Kerouac's Oriental Experience and Liminality. So yeah, I just want to do a little more justice to Peggy's work. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Peggy Piccini.
all right, so can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So, but the only thing is that, as usual, yeah, okay, perfect. So can I just maybe do this so that you're not on? Okay, so France has definitely a special relationship with the beats, and so have their poets. And so I'm just gonna turn myself. Okay, and so have their poets and writers. And yet it is difficult to trace an everlasting connection between the original beats and the French followers. Many have jumped overboard in the course of the journey and never to return to either beat topos, topoi, ethos, consciousness, or aesthetics. Others, like Serge Pey, Lucien Suel, who probably some of you remember from the EBSN in Paris. He was performing and reading. Alain Gégou and Michel Bultor, even Zénou Bianu, have established their own authority, while never really turning away from the subterranean mentors who opened the doors and the road for them. That is what some of them call their pantheon. Without, however, being too negative, except for a few poets and writers whose long-standing not only Kerouac, but also beat heritage has been confirmed and nourished, like Suel or Bianu, for instance, whom unfortunately for various practical reasons due to COVID, closure of libraries, etc., I won't talk about today. It is not so much a literary poetic tradition or consciousness that today's poets, French poets, novelists, or playwrights explore or appropriate, but the legendary iconic horror, the beats, mostly Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Burroughs, the trilogy, channel. And I won't expand on that mythologizing aspect of the beat legacy in France. However, I wouldn't want to be misinterpreted in my moderation as to the enduring influence, legacy, or cross-fertilization of the beats on contemporary French poetry and fiction. As my research and knowledge so far is still in progress and not primarily my field of expertise, that is especially the French, the French contemporary poetry. In my paper today, I would like to first recontextualize the French poet's connection to the beat ethos, aesthetic, and consciousness, and secondly, offer a retrospective look into one group of French poets who entered in poetry at the turn of the 60s and 70s, with a manifesto, the violence of which struck as insurgent and radical, a group self-labeled the Electric Poets, who for part of them were still productive today and often recall their legacies to the beat in the form of dedication and intertextual tribute, but most importantly, in a common consciousness of what poetry is and where it is rooted as a total physical, organic act, perhaps whereby living and writing are one. All right, but this is probably the last part of it will be for another paper in another session later on. So I would like to begin with Claude Pellieu. I would like to start reminding that the beat generation reverberation in France is also filtered through the key figure or the key eye of Claude Pellieu, who is definitely the very embodiment of French-American literary overlap and linkage. And not primarily through Pellieu's translation of beat writers, Kaufman, Burroughs, and Ginsberg, but more deeply through his poetry and text and how they resonate among French avant-garde and countercultural poets. In 1966, Alain Geoffroy, a French poet who published with Jean-Jacques Lebel the first beat poetry anthology in French in 1965, La Poésie de la Beat Generation, put together a special issue of the Belgian magazine Fantomas. The issue, entitled Apparatus, offered an heterogeneous array of transnational avant-garde poetry and prose, with the undistinguished aim of affirming the importance of beats like Ginsberg, Burroughs, Corso, and Pellieu, together with French names like Geoffroy himself, Denis Roche, sound poet François Dufresne, concrete poet Jean-Clarence Lambert, but also Antonin Artaud and Denis Roche. As the title of the issue suggests, several contributions not only address the very function of poetry and its artistic, social, and political function, but the complex structure of a particular burgeoning poetic system. So I have translated all the time the titles in English, and I placed the French titles on the PPT. So in The Climate in the Congo, which opens the issue, Alain Geoffroy sketches the collective language that each avant-garde poet is reinventing. The text reads like a manifesto for a radical collective language to free poetry from the periods, I quote, darkening rigidity, end of quote. The aim is one of poetics, to be broken up, disintegrated, cut through, or electrified. The piece, provided by Ginsberg, Burroughs, and Corso's contribution, was entitled La douce machine à écrire, the soft typewriter. An extract from Corso and Ginsberg's interview with Burroughs, published in 1951 in the Journal for the Protection of All Beings, actually. The extract largely focuses on the manipulation, mutation, and expansion of consciousness, on the dismantlement of the machine, a body of control, and the advent or rising of a new consciousness, which can best be achieved through detachment from the tyranny of received word forms. Pellieu's contribution to the issue is a poem telegraph entitled Blackout Special. If the Beat's contribution and Pellieu's contribution offered French readership a new way of grasping, connecting or disconnecting, and comprehending the world while refusing all forms of manipulation and brainwashing, they also offered some young French poet a writing method, which Pellieu heralds in his poem. Tomorrow's writing is looming in our coded messages. Let's step forward in silence. Logical mists in the Palace Hell, New York, November 55. Stop. Claude Pellieu. The ideas behind this telegram pave the way for the second phase in the influence of beat writing and techniques on French literature, which came with the publication in 1967 of Le Cahier de Lerne, issue number 9, dedicated to Burroughs, Pellieu, and Kaufman's text, with translations by Pellieu himself. This was certainly decisive in introducing new cut-ups techniques into contemporary French prose and poetry. This is just 1 year to the students and workers' upheaval of Mai 1968, or what is referred to here in France as les événements. Beat Connections offered young and young aspiring poets the pathway into unexpected imaginative terrain from an American full of vibrant countercultural challenge and energy. In combination, beat influence and French youth radicalism helped to break out from more, I quote, academic literary writing and from what Jean-Jacques Lebel calls the dull Frenchy poetry published in archaic literary magazine and in left bank academic stronghold. Poet Christian Prigent also explains that if his reading of Corso and Ginsberg reminded him that they shared a common heritage in the surrealist movement, the beat poetry was radically countercultural, both as a linguistic and social revolution. What is Prigent addressing here is the possible renaissance of the surrealist movement in France in the aftermath of May 68 upheaval. If not a renaissance, at least Prigent retrospectively understood that these aspiring young poets, with their attraction to the magic and magnetism of the beat, were taking surrealism and perhaps also soon beat ethos and writing into wholly new reaches. In 1969, Pellieu's volume Ce que dit la bouche d'ombre dans la bronze étoile d'une tête, What the Mouth of Darkness in the Bronze Star of a Head Says, and Dernière minute électrifiée, Last Electrified Minute, is published. Its impact shouldn't be undermined. This is a volume of poem and pamphlet, which clearly reflects the ambition to incubate both beat and surrealist energy among French avant-garde circles. In Ce que dit la bouche d'ombre, Pellieu uses his own text from from beat writers and French poets as well, to precisely push the limits of surrealism, conjuring Burroughs, Weissner, Breton, Hugo, Kerouac, Lautréamont, and others, and produce a cut-up which claims that, I quote, direct action words are no longer needed, end of quote, to explore the infra-conscious. Time, language, and space must be cleared off. Pellieu's cut-up offer insight into the coded message transmitted, or rather, I quote, cried out from the border articulation. The question Pellieu raises is, where's the limit? Keep only the mouth of darkness, compose with the colorless veins of your name? The Mouth of Darkness is a long visionary poem by Victor Hugo, where the mouth of darkness, which incarnates general, universal, and prophetic discourse, is a specter who visits the speaker and prophesies the end of time, with the trope of darkness being linked with the time of experience. But the mouth of darkness is also, and perhaps primarily, a direct reference to Burroughs' Naked Lunch. In the place, I quote, "In this place of total darkness, mouth and eyes are one transparent organ that leaps forward to snap with transparent teeth," end of quote. So let's move now to our electric poets. In 1971, piloted by Michel Bulteau and Mathieu Messager, a group of poets in their 20s, known as the Electric Poets, published what is now known as Manifeste électrique aux paupières de jupe, which can be translated as Electric Manifesto with Skirt Eyelids. The volume is a complex, sometimes even obscure and fragmented poetic manifesto of single and collective contribution, which at first glance perpetuates the surrealist heritage by hinting at Breton and supposes the magnetic field published in 1920. Except for Bulteau and Messager, the 14 other signatories each made a single contribution to the volume. Quite unsurprisingly, it was Alain Geoffroy, whom I mentioned before, who energetically supported the manifesto, showing how, in aims and practice, the manifesto differed from the magnetic field and other surrealistic production. The influence of the beats on its authors becomes clear even upon first browsing. Looking back on the manifesto, Zinubianu, once one of the contributors, and I mentioned his name before, defines it as an incantation, a powerful art form in its own right, which blends Kerouac's vision with the hypnotism of the Velvet Underground's first album. So here again, it also goes back to what we said before, how poetry and music was linked. Thierry Lamar's Kerouac mantra, dedicated to Jack Kerouac, as the title suggests, so it's dedicated to Jack Kerouac of stars from spirit to spirit. The poem is fraught with Kerouac almost verbatim intertext. The fragmented structure of the poem is a journey into the darkness of life and its suffering to, I quote, save life from one continent to the other. There are very few moments in the poem when the starry night is benevolent, but some nights when everything collapses, the balance line, I quote, becomes the infinite point, the hexagram. This reference actually to what you have mentioned to Ben just a moment ago, so this reference to the I Ching or Book of Changes encapsulates the cryptic, infraconscious meaning of the manifesto as a whole. Yet it is primary Burroughs' influence that permeates the volume. His tactics defined by Ginsberg as follows. I quote, "The method must be purest meat and no symbolic dressing, actual visions and actual presence, as seen then and now," end of quote. So not only is the poem Le déluge secouait la glace, that is, the deluge shook the ice, one of the prose poems written by Jean-Jacques Fossot and Michel Bulteau dedicated to Burroughs, but the poem also seeks to deploy his narrative approach. So I'm not going to read the whole extract, but I've placed it on the PowerPoint for you to just browse at it. Lacking punctuation, except for hyphens and slashes, this prose poem offers a mosaic of juxtaposition in defiance of linear order. The effect is to liberate the language virus, alluded to in the opening line, and to render syntax and word as a species of lexical warfare. The technique used in the manifesto very much echoes Pellieu's other works of the same period, such as 1,000 Mobiles from Journal Blanc du Hasard, White Journal of Chance, not to mention Pellieu's new Declaration of Independence. His definition of technique perfectly applies to the electric volume as a whole, that he defines as a journey through the entrails of a personal syntax, with themes unfolding, wandering from one pole to the other, with all the suns wandering once again, enlightening what poetry wanted them to be, virus words and gadget images. These poems also Hiko So Who Owns Death TV, published in 1967, so Pellius' collaboration with Weisner and Burroughs. The similarity is revealed by the mechanical word combination created by intersecting or cutting through the syntax. In another poem, Mouche flagrante et ombrageuse, which can be translated as obvious shadowy fly, for instance, Ferry and Bulto exercise as such combination, and I've quoted some of them here for you. The Electric Manifesto is itself an experimental field. The poems pitched against the grain of standard grammar and syntax. They aim to pattern this deconstruction, disruption, mutilation, and capitalization. Rhythms become deliberately jerky and slashed. Syntax becomes deliberately dense and obscurantist. The following line from the same poem, Obvious Shadowy Fly, provides a reading method for the would-be undecipherable technique of the electric poets. I quote, "Three got hold of the phases, did not decipher which required by chaos," end of quote. It also traces its origin back to structural and semantic chaos then. However, as in Pellius Cut-Ups, it is the final text itself that operates as coalescence. The manifesto poem, that is the manifesto poem written that actually closes the whole volume and written by Michel Bulto, is very similar to Claude Pellieu's poem Enfant Collage, Children Collage, and which is actually dedicated to Alain Jouffroy. Pellieu's poem is dedicated to Alain Jouffroy. And here is a selection, I mean, it's a long poem, and it's just a selection for you to read of the manifesto poem, which actually is not named the manifesto poem, but which I called manifesto poem. So this manifesto poem defines the experimental method of the electric poet. It is as if this poet had actually risen out of Claude Pellieu's poem, Children Collage, to utter their electric yelp or their electric howl. The last lines of Claude Pellieu's poem reads in confirmation. Children, poetry abandons you to chaos. Children create the void. Children of hallucinax, you're no longer objects. So as a conclusion, I would say that the raw, violent form of the manifesto can be read as the poet's resolution to break with whatever poetry is and has produced so far, and had produced, sorry, so far. A poetry of their generation, electric, as it was beat for the former generation. Of the manifesto genre, it retains the polemic and programmatic stance, and it was undoubtedly meant to be inaugural, but not theoretical. It experiments with all the possible way of cutting through language, and its signatories aimed at creating interferences by consciously blurring and subverting all grammatical categories and introducing a series of coded typographic symbols too. The electric poet addressed bluntly, almost physically, the meaning of creativity and the writing of prose and poetry, which they saw as, I quote, writing about a mutilation, end of quote. These poets use the word as a knife. What actually Lucas is in his anthology here, perhaps you will see that, I don't know if you see it, so he published a whole anthology of the electric poet, metaphorically calls the white weapon of thought. The lexical field, of course, of drug and sex addiction is developed paroxystically and viscerally in the anthology and carried out through an inner vision, which is altogether pure and destructive. as destructive as the experiences their speaker have been confronted to. Like the beats, the electric poet lived and wrote unfiltered, raw, wildly, and unconditionally. Against the death of thoughts and consciousness, words are like, I quote, needles sounding the invisible, end of quote. For this generation, coming of age in the wake of the countercultural 1960s and the conventional mortifying 1950s. If their poetry might sound sometimes adolescently rebellious at their beginning, it grew in the footsteps of Permutation, Burroughs, Ginsberg, to a certain extent into a French beat aesthetic, which offers in its viscerality and violence an unsubdued poetics, altogether disturbingly vertiginous and aesthetically nauseous. The electric poet manipulates language, take it for what it is, a connector of mental electricity, so as to try and change how people see, feel, think against the frame of a word where everything is decided for them, is programmed so as to keep them straight into the line. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great presentation as well. So let's open it up to questions. So do we have any? Either raise your hand, I guess, in the raise your hand category, or just raise your hand or unmute yourself. There's not too many of us. I think we can not devolve into cacophony here.
Can I?
Peggy.
Yeah, I wanted just to thank you. Well, of course, Ben and Judy, and how the two of you, even if it was not the same period, but actually resonated. But I also wanted to thank Judy for your presentation, because first of all, I discovered, I discovered, and I'm not confident in pronouncing the name. So, but Lee, if I say Lee, is that all right? Yeah. Okay. I'm very happy just to have encountered that artist, and I was wondering because I was working on works, by Bruce Conner, and the work that also he did with Michael McClure in the mid-50s, early 60s, and I was wondering, because that sound also, there are many echoes beyond even Brian Gysin. So I was wondering if there had been any connection, or if you are aware of any connection, any other perhaps links between these visual artists and other beat connections. This is my first question. And my second one was perhaps a naive one, but I was wondering, because you showed like this accordion work, and I was wondering if you would consider it beyond just the fact that it is a painting or a work of art. Can it be read also as a poem itself? Would that be possible to read it also as a poem itself? Especially because afterwards you showed that he was working with other poets. It kind of resonate, but this one has been made by he himself and has no, so I was just wondering if that would be a possibility or something that we can actually work on.
Can I ask the second question you raised? You mean like his scroll paper
Yes,
creation?
exactly, yeah.
I can share a book.
Because this was really something that was done at the period, not only by the Beats, but I remember like George Brash was doing that, like the Rogers School was doing that. And I was wondering, this is something for me that is really a real question, is how all this person started in doing this, this kind of production, poetic production, in collaboration or not in collaboration, and how that, or where all this originates. And my question was that, is all this originated from the I Ching book or not? Is that, this is one of my questions also.
Okay, so I think you can see like Yuan-chia, his scroll paper, This kind of scroll paper, I think you can say it's a Chinese tradition. Like, or maybe the emperor, they will open their paper to read like all the politic, he has to write something on the like it's like a government, like the policy that the emperor has to read it. So this kind of folding paper has been a long tradition in Chinese. And also, do you know a painting is called a very famous painting is called 清明上河图. Let me try to find it. It's a very long scroll. Can you see this? It's a very long scroll, and it's very long, and it maintains all the night market picture. So this long scroll paper has a long history, but Li's art, he made it very special because, as you can see, this book, you have to turn it. It's very long. It's actually very long. So I think this is a combination of Western and Eastern art. And because usually when they paint on this long scroll, you will have many detailed images, but not just like this simple. And as you say about his connection, I think it's worth digging into, because when Li was in London, he has an exhibition in, as I mentioned, in Signals Gallery, and he also in Lison Galleries. And I think it's in Lison Gallery that he has connection with Don Silster, the artist I mentioned. He has connection with Burroughs. And also, like I mentioned, I think it's important to mention that he built his own museum in the north of England. And when he's there, he tried to create a space that invites artists from different places. For example, a very famous and important electronic musician, a female musician called Delia Derbyshire. She was in her museum too, and other important artists. Actually, if you go to Yuan-chia's website, you can see a long list of artists that have connection with him. So I think maybe you can look into that. And I have to admit that I don't know all the artists that has connection with him, all their details, because there are many. But I think it's really worth looking into. Yeah.
But it was actually this kind of I mean, not so much connection, because perhaps in fact there is none, but the fact that, as Ben, you said, this is transnational. It's that it happens at the same period, and I can't make sense where that actually originates. And I don't even see, even in America, the connection between the Roger group and McClure and Connors. So this is, for me, just a mystery. I would like to find this answer. How do we connect all this? And I don't know. So
no. So in my paper, I mentioned Don Silster, who is a friend with Burroughs, and I can only say that Don Silster has connection with Burroughs, but I cannot be sure that whether Li has connection with the Beat. But I think that because they are friends, so, and Li's influenced by Don Silster's an aesthetic style. So maybe it's through this indirect like style or technique, because they are through their friendship that they influence each other. Like maybe Li also influenced Don Silster. This I cannot be sure, because it's really hard to know like what really made them have this idea. But I think because of that time, in that like post-World War II, the people travel from different places, maybe under the political forces, but it also is a chance for them to kind of like exchange their ideas. And London is an opportunity for Li to explore. So I think he absorbed the beauty of Western art, but he also, from his own Chinese identity, he used this calligraphic painting to try to combine these two aesthetic into his artwork. Yeah.
Good.
I wanted to just sort of add to that a little bit and think it's kind of amazing, and it makes us as critics to kind of look back at ourselves and wonder. I was questioning myself a couple of times in writing the papers. Is this here? I mean, is this an influence, or is it just my own knowledge and my own mindset bringing this to the text and saying, well, maybe she was influenced by Burroughs, maybe not. And again, it's that, are those connections, Li Yuan-chia and the Beat, are they actually there? Or, it just seems that Geissen painting is so kind of similar, so sort of resonant that you just want there to be that connection, but are we putting too much? Are we making connections that aren't actually there? Or is that our job? I mean, are we looking for this? Is it our worldliness as critics to do this, to make these connections and to try and figure out what's important about this and what's relevant about this, and figure out what we're actually here to do?
I mean, it seems like you could take an opposite tack. I mean, those are the questions I was kind of coming up with as well. What people have been saying. I mean, there's obviously seems to be these connections, but I mean, go the other direction. Think about intentionality. There seems to be a different intentionality, right? I mean, for Burroughs, it's like a technique that seems to transcend, right? It's Dada, but it's also contemporary, right? But it's also and it's Beat, but it's other people. It's all over the world. But the intention sometimes seems. Maybe that's a way of thinking about it. Like for instance, for Burroughs, it seems we're about the word virus. We're going to get rid of the word, kind of doing these techniques is getting out of that kind of typical conscious way of reading or experiencing the world through the word. But it seems like for your presentation, Ben, for instance, that's not what it's about, right? It's about a visual object. It's like aesthetic object, right? Creation or something like that. So, I mean, maybe we could flip it and kind of think of like, okay, well, it's a shared technique, dematerializing or materializing the word, but the goal of that is it seems to be very different depending on who's doing it and where they're doing it and when they're doing it. Yeah,
I think you're right. I think again, what we're doing here is we're using a Beat lens, and we're kind of coming at I'm certainly my Chinese is not that great, so I'm coming at this as an outsider, and I'm using my kind of knowledge of Burroughs and the Beat. And I saw this text, my colleague here at Zhongden showed me this book, and I'm like, wow, what is this? And it just made me think of Burroughs and the cut-ups. And then the more I learned about it, the more I was seeing these resonances, and I just felt, that there's something to this. But as you say, it's, whether it's direct appropriation or whether there just happens to be interconnections. Again, this book came out in 2007. Burroughs and the cut-ups are sort of imbibed in underground culture. Those techniques are there and are resonant. So, that we have these more sort of indirect interconnections there and resonances that, as you say, it's really interesting to see how, how they go, but what are the differences, and what is the difference now, and how is it now, become contemporary, and how is it reappropriated, and how is it reappropriated across cultures, and what does it tell us about things like poetics, about again with what Sonya was talking about with your transmedial forms, and does this take us sort of back to, I was thinking about Peggy's presentation when you mentioned about Bulto's prose poem dedicated to Burroughs, and I've been working on this article about Burroughs poetry, and sort of he mentions this connection with Baudelaire's Little Blue Book, the prose poetry stuff, and Paris Spleen, and it sort of brings me back to that and thinking about, what are these distinctions, and what do they mean? And is this what we're dealing with when we're thinking about Beat? We're thinking just about sort of classifications and categories, and this is the same as with nation and with gender and all these different sort of fundamentals that we're dealing with here. Is this what, again, is this our job to try and open these elements up and think about them in different ways?
Anybody want to answer that question? I mean, maybe we're putting too much on beat, right? I mean, dematerializing the word is, you know, ongoing. I mean, Brian Kim Stephan's Dream Life of Letters, right? I mean, internet, you know, you can use the computer now in more ways than just various permutations of the poem. I mean, you can visualize it in various ways, right? So it's like, it's almost like maybe that's always been the case. And, you know, we're just seeing certain moments where people come in and do it in different ways for different reasons. And, you know, maybe our job is to kind of make sense of that. You know, why would Burroughs, you know, why would the beats, I mean, there's going to be cross connections. Some things this, I thought Judy's paper is quite interesting. You know, this Wu Wei, you know, this effortless effort, you know, kind of thing. I mean, you know, so you have spontaneity, but it's like the irony is a lot of these techniques, it seems like it's kind of eschewing spontaneity, right? It's like, well, it's like the, you know, set the machine in on this and see what it does, you know, and it's kind of spontaneous, but it's kind of not like this humanistic spontaneity that we associate with the beats, right? So Burroughs in some ways seems at odds with the beats, you know, with the conception that beats is spontaneous, personal, romantic expression, right? So, you know, I don't know, I find that interesting. I don't know what to do with it, but I think these distinctions are kind of interesting. Are there no other questions or comments? I don't want to, huh?
Yeah, I can ask a question maybe. Yeah, so I guess congratulations to all three of you for wonderful presentations. I'm always learning a lot, and this is a great break from my reality teaching technical English. I'm so sick and tired of talking about machines in English, so this is good. So I guess my question is mostly for Judy and Ben, because I kept thinking, I mean, you've been mentioning influence when you've been talking about the visual influence and the connection between poetry and the visual arts. You've been mentioning Taoism, Buddhism, calligraphy, and all these things. And I was wondering whether maybe especially younger generations of poets who may or may not claim to be beat, are they responding in any way to issues of cultural appropriation in any way? And I'm thinking about this because the beats have sometimes been accused of using other cultures in a very superficial way. And I'm thinking if this has been a trend in any way for poets who may write in the beat tradition or maybe not, and maybe be critical to some of the ways in which the beats appropriated or were influenced by Buddhism or Taoism or used calligraphy in their own work. Again, you may not have an answer because again, you need a poet who claims to be beat, and maybe that's something we cannot find. So just a thought.
Ben, do you want to go first, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a difficult question because, you know, Hsia Yu is certainly someone who's, you could argue, has appropriated elements of, you know, Western poetry. And again, you know, Judy's talking about Li Yuan-chia and his appropriation of Western culture. I was kind of thinking, as you were saying, your question about Peggy's paper and the journal that had the Burroughs, Kaufman, Pellier issue. And I was just thinking about how many, I wonder how many kind of American literary journals had kind of French texts and had sort of a bilingual kind of focus, and how many French texts there are. And again, it's the same with seeing this in Hsia Yu's poetry and how she uses English and French and Chinese, and has a very, I mean, I've got her works in translation, and she sort of very prominently makes them very different from the Chinese editions and has the translator's name very prominently on the text. So I think, again, Hsia Yu is very aware of the impact and the issues with translation. And I was thinking this with Esther, and Esther's paper yesterday is about that kind of appropriation of beat, of a kind of conceptualization of beat that is like maybe misappropriated. It's like, is Albie beat? Is, Zoo's story actually beat? And then is this cultural appropriation really like to be encouraged? I mean, is American culture at that point, is it cool? Is it something you want to demonstrate, or is it the opposite? I think, Erik, you and I were sort of talking about this a little bit after the meeting yesterday, about how, in China there was there were sort of banned books in the 50s, and they had beat books like On the Road and Howl. And so they were banned, and they were shown to be examples of decadence. And then sort of members of the Red Guard would sneak in and steal them and go and share them. And they'd be like, oh, these are the cool American things that we're not allowed to read. So this sort of idea of cultural appropriation and the idea of cool. I mean, I'm also thinking about, I guess, the reception in America itself of beat, and how beat became beatnik and became something that was made foreign and made outside. It was made, it's kind of half Russian, and it's a bad thing. So I guess, like, I don't know if that starts to answer your question, but I think these are elements that perhaps we need to think about when we're looking at beat appropriation, misappropriation, and some of these sort of tangents can work. Does that help, or does that answer some aspect of your question? Did you want to say anything about this, Judy?
Yes, I think perhaps for Beat generation, their connection with Taoism might be rather a bit maybe superficial, because I think Taoism is actually, it's a life philosophy. It's a lifestyle. It's something you have to follow it with the way you live, and so it's just like Wu Wei. It's not just a form of art. As I said, like maybe Yuan-chia, he expressed Taoism in his art, but can we say he really follow it? Maybe we have to think about like how he lived his life. But as I think, like he moved to north of England, and he wrote that he has no connection with the outer world. I think, and also like Taoism also highlights to live in harmony with the nature. I think like these things can be regarded as like whether like someone's really taking Taoism into his heart. Like it's not just a form, a superficial form of art. Like, today I wrote some calligraphy and I'm a Taoist. It's not that superficial. So maybe, like I cannot argue maybe Berners Bing or J.D. Ford, they are total Taoist, or Buddhism, even Zen. Zen itself is not just. I think today we think Zen is a style, it's a feeling, but actually Zen is a religion. Like it is something profounder. It's not just a feeling, So I think that's also what I think is quite important. Like maybe Taoism in 1950s is a quite cool thing to do, or make you different. Like maybe what in the hippies movement, but I think it's actually something more profounder in our culture. Yeah. That's my answer. I don't know whether it's, yeah.
Sure, yeah. I mean, my question was, but again, maybe this is impossible to answer because we may not have poets who directly address these issues. So it was just something that I was thinking, because I've heard about people complaining that they're using this in a very superficial manner, or they might be using this in a superficial manner. And I was wondering whether you knew of any poets who, while still claiming to follow the beats in some ways or different ways, they may directly address this issue of using someone's culture in a way that might be superficial. But again, it's a complex question because we might not find these people.
I mean, I can think of one sort of British Chinese writer who's appropriated Ginsberg in a very sort of superficial way. There's Guo Xiaolu has published a novel a few years ago called I Am Chinese, and it appropriates, you know, in it she quotes Ginsberg's poem, you know, America, but changing the word America to China, right? That's it.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I mean, Peggy, do you want to talk?
I would just like to comment something very quickly about the superficiality of the Buddhist concepts or the Taoist concepts. I think we could see that happening in the United States in the 60s. Robert Brustein, for example, who was a very famous, a key figure of the theater criticism, pointed out that the zoo story was a Beat product. And he actually said, oh, it has all the Beat religious claptrap, he said, just because he understood that some of the metaphysical aspects of the text were for some reason connected to Buddhism. And I think that was based on his misunderstanding of the Buddhist concepts. And so I think that in the United States, there was, I think that the Buddhist references were very superficial, even for the critics. And I think that the critics are to blame for some of the things that were written about certain kinds of works. And so, for example, that the zoo story back then during the initial reception was labeled as a Beat work. I think this is very much connected to Robert Brustein, who for some reason saw Buddhist references there, where in fact, I don't think there were no references. You know, you had metaphysical aspects, but it is very different from, you know, Buddhism. But for some reason, he saw it as a connection. So he said, oh, no, this is what Allen Ginsberg does. And so I think that also critics, I think, were very superficial in some of the judgments.
Peggy, do you want to talk a bit about, you had a comment I thought was quite interesting, and I was also interested in your talking a bit more about, you talked about the electric poets and about how they're kind of still kind of, you know, using the beats or representing the beats. Can you talk a bit about that, and maybe you know, what's the status of the beats in France today? I mean, is this
so first thing before I answer your question, I was just saying in the discussion, you know, of that perhaps instead of thinking of cultural appropriation, maybe we should simply think of cultural translation, because I think that the Beats, even in their research for Buddhism or for Taoism or for Zen Buddhism, well, there was something true in it. They studied it. I mean, they wanted to just dig into it. It was just not. It was serious matter. It's just that perhaps they translated it in their own way, and some did not even translate it. They practiced it until the end of, I mean, I think of Phil Wallen and many others. So this is not fake. This was there, but I think perhaps we should think of this idea of translation, as you were just saying, Ben, for different things. But also in terms of cultural translation, simply. And as far as the electric poets are concerned, well, this is, I mean, they're no longer together. I mean, in the sense that but like the Beats, they were a group of friends. And I think this is important too, in the way how you conceive of a group sharing, even if they have their own individuality and if they have their own style, they're writing, and they're not in the same way. Some are more violent, some are more romantic, some are doing poetry, some novels, but actually their work resonates. And well, this one of the reasons why I couldn't expand also more on how these, I mean, like, for instance, Yu, who I've talked about, is that they started with Kerouac, Burroughs, and the Surrealists. Eventually, what they produced in the Electric Manifesto was something that was, as I said, very much in the vein of Burroughs and the cut-ups, with traces of what Kerouac, I mean, and a kind of idealistic journey or quest journey he embodied. They wanted also to have that in their poems. But now, for instance, for Yu, he's totally into Zen. He's a translator. He has translated Zen and Buddhism, and he has translated a lot of text. And what he writes, and this is a point I want to just dig into, is his poetry centered on the idea of breath, all right? Which is totally linked with how also our beat poets are writing. And not just, I don't mean just Ginsberg in the line, in his long line, but I also mean McClure, I also mean Snyder, and others, those we talk less. And I want to try to make, but I mean, I had no time to do this for this presentation, but this is definitely something I really want to dig into, is how this idea of breath linked to words and language, simply, and poetry as the vital force of it, was already there in their poetic manifesto, but which had not gained at that time, like the philosophical background, and that it has now in their later poems. So basically, the only ones that are still writing from the band are Michel Bulteau, who is like a very enigmatic person, who doesn't talk about his poetry. There's hardly anything written on that, simply because he's really refusing any kind of analysis of what it has. The text is here, and it's sufficient in itself. Is that if you ask him about his poetry, even why he writes, he simply answers that he's a poet, all right? And his job is doing, I mean, he's not mentioning job, but he's saying, basically, I can't speak about poetry because I am a poet, and poetry is poetry. So if you want to understand what I write, just read it. Okay, so what do you do with that? Okay, because it's not, and then what he produces is very, very dark. He has stepped away a bit from Burroughs. He wants to be like the key figure, the kind of dandy-like, rebellious type that has somehow inaugurated a new poetic era in France, but he's not seen in that way by other French contemporary writers. So basically, he's really, he represents something that in the 1970s was really important and strong, and really was a kind of countercultural poetics, but that now is kind of traditional, more romantic, like almost Renaissance-like, you know. So he's doing very more traditional poetry, like most of them do now. So it's difficult to trace that that genealogy all along until now, except in specific poems. So so yes, there are traces, and there are ways into which you can enter the poetry and still find some connection or even resonance. So as I said, this idea of breath is something perhaps that should be looked into more deeply. Yes. So I don't know, Erik, if I answered exactly your question, but and otherwise, it's just another example, and I end that. It's just that also that is linked with everything we said. Is that, for instance, I was thinking, okay, I have there is one writer who whose name is Sylvain Tesson, all right, who's writing novels, and his novels are very much like Kerouac. It's like as if he is the embodiment himself of Dean Moriarty in real life, and he writes like Jack Kerouac. Is the white pace, is going on the road, is experiencing at the extremes, etc. And never in his books is he recognizing, even mentioning Jack Kerouac. And as you read them, it's just like it's Kerouac every page, you know. So there, I mean, I'm just concerned about it. I mean, is Dean, he's living his life like Dean, he's doing things like Dean, he's writing like Kerouac, he goes everywhere in the world and exploring new territories and barriers and into the wild, putting himself in the most extremist condition. And no, I mean, nowhere is Kerouac, nowhere is Snyder, nowhere. So here's the question, how far can we push this connection into our, I mean, if not projecting what we read in what we read. What?
Yeah,
so I don't know if...
Is that like cultural appropriation, or would you call that like plagiarism? I don't know.
Life plagiarism, right?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think this is that. This is transnationalism. I mean, it's just that it's there, and then we take it, we write about it in our own, but we want to make connection, most probably.
Well, I think there's a time element with that as well, because it's like, you know, people now don't know who the Beats are even, you know. I sort of bumped into somebody in a coffee shop the other day and was looking over my shoulder at what I was doing. It's like, this is an American guy, and he's just like, what's the Beat generation? I'm like, what? You know, you don't know your national culture. And it's really interesting to kind of think of that in those terms, and how these things kind of ebb and flow and again become re-ingrained into different cultural forms. You know, it's just sort of history repeating itself again, I guess.
Yeah, if I ask my students who the Beats are, they don't know. I just am in my class.
Yeah, they'll know the sort of fashion of like Levi's, right? They wear Levi's, or they'll go on a Gap Year trek, and you know, and understand, you know, elements that have come from Beat culture. It's really interesting.
Other comments? We have
Can I? Yeah, I think because we are passionate about the artists or the writers we discuss, that's why we want to talk about them on our paper. And the same, maybe they have the passion to, maybe for Buddhism or Taoism, it is the passion that they want to make connection. It's like me. In fact, at first, originally I just went to Yuan-chia's exhibition. I just found, wow, this artist, I really love him. And because Ben invited for this conference, and I said, okay, I want to write about Yuan-chia, I can find some connection. And I didn't know that I can really find some, but I think this is our love for them, that we want to keep talking about them. And I think it doesn't matter whether they are real Buddhism or Taoism or not, but I think it's important that we keep making connection and keep talking about them, so they can be more known to other people. That's what I think. Thank you.
Anything else? Or are we wrapping up? Or I don't want to close down conversation if people have more comments, but I don't want to.
No, again, you know, Judy's point is an interesting one about coming at something as a scholar or as a fan. You know, I think there's elements of both, and we see that in the EBSN quite a bit, because we try to sort of combine both elements, really, don't we? We sort of encourage scholars, performers, and enthusiasts and fans, and that sort of interconnection is often really quite interesting. But you know, as scholars, you know, do we have to maintain this distance and sort of see something as a fan, as art we can appreciate, but also, you know, read it in a sort of dispassionate way? Again, I find that, you know, that dichotomy really kind of interesting. I don't know what anyone else thinks about that issue.
Well, Ben, anyway, the way you introduced that, I mean, your paper was fantastic. And I mean, this was obvious as you were, it was just like as you were presenting, it was just obvious. The more you would present and turn the pages, it was just like, okay, this is there. And And I was fascinated by the pink noise one, especially. Yeah. I mean, this kind of, you know, this idea you were saying about the fact that you had to place that paper in between the pages, because otherwise you had no perspective, you couldn't read because everything was one. And it reminded me the first time I saw, I mean, this is totally different, but it has a connection, don't worry. The first time I saw the scroll, it was just like it's typed so tight that you see the word, you see the lines, but it's like vertiginous, you know, you enter the scroll like this, and it's the same with yours. I mean, in the sense that all the words are there, it just is a mass, and then as you open, suddenly, but this is a really fantastic object too. And this is where poetry and art, I mean, and the object becomes art. It's just a full object. Yeah,
I should show you this edition as well. It came with this. I mean, it's crazy in a lot of ways, because it came with a whole bunch of extra stuff. You know, it came in a case with her signature on, and it had this slightly crazy. Better be careful with this. Like a signed poster that she produced as well. You can see that. It's really fascinating. And there's also like a cover band as well that goes around it, which of course reminded me of Minutes to Go, right? A really interesting band around Minutes to Go. And on it, again, which I have to find some way of reading it, she says, "I've always wanted to make a transparent book, and after I'd finished composing the 33 poems gathered here, I knew the time had come to make this book of poetry filled with written noise. Then I put it in an aquarium and a swimming pool and left it in the rain for days. This is a book that knows no limits and thus knows not to go too far." Great. And then all these postcards of, as you can see, the book in water, immersed in water. So, I mean, it's a stunning level of creativity that she's got. I was actually corresponding with her as well. I was hoping to maybe get her to speak at a conference as well, or sort of, you know, get involved, have her involved in some way, but unfortunately she was unable to. But yeah, she's a really kind of interesting figure, and particularly in her life, just living between France and Taiwan, and sort of between languages in some way as well. It's really sort of embodying, as we were talking about, embodying the art as well. Really interesting.
What's also interesting in that is that the paper is the white paper is no longer visible. So the words stand as, in your volume, in the pink one, since it's transparent, there's no, it's as if no paper was there any longer, and that the words stand as themselves, is that, yeah.
Just like this, it's so great. I didn't show you the other one as well. I forgot to mention this in my paper. So the book of poetry and photographs. Yeah, actually, if you open the back cover, oh, fell out. Okay, inside the back cover, there's a little tiny book, a book within a book, and that contains all of the poetry. So all the words that are under the poems are in this little book inside the book. It's amazing. And she publishes this stuff herself as well. It's sort of out of her own pocket. So because of course, well, this was the problem with the Third Mind, the original edition of the Third Mind, Burroughs' The Third Mind, and of course, Apuk is Here, which were these sort of large-scale art book, graphic novel projects that again they couldn't get a publisher to publish. So Hsia Yu's got over that problem by doing it herself.
Well, maybe we should wrap up. I noticed that we're probably gonna get kicked out of this site, this room pretty soon. But I'd like to thank everybody again, everybody for coming in, for all the presenters, great presentations, another interesting day. And hope to see everybody here tomorrow, same time, same place. Love to see all of you. And yeah, thanks for coming.
Bye. See ya.
See you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Congratulations to all the presenters. The papers were wonderful.
Well done, Judy.
Thank you, everyone.